well, in the coming weeks, we're going to get more into kind of strictly history. And we're going to talk about how Scripture got from the point at which it was agreed upon, what qualified as Scripture, to, we'll bring it up to the development of the King James Bible, because that's where we have the first universally accepted English translation of Scripture. So we're going to be covering that history, and it focuses a great deal on Reformation movements in Eastern Europe, in places like the Czech Republic, or what is now the Czech Republic, Bohemia, Germany, but it's going to take us all over Europe. And so we'll start the history portion of this in a few weeks. Next week, we're going to dedicate the entire class to discussing the Apocrypha, or the deuterocanonical books, those strange, mysterious books that we don't have in our Bible, that some people do, and we're going to take away some of the mystery and talk about them, why they're not there, and if and why they might be important to know. But today we're going to continue with a little bit of the more technical history. We ended last week talking about the world that Christ was born into and the things that happened in what we call the intertestamental period, which is that 300 or 400 years after the prophets had completed their prophesying in the Old Testament, up until the time of Christ's birth, or the prelude to his birth. A lot of things happened that were very important. They're not recorded in our Bible. They're not recorded in Scripture. But they are historical events that are recorded elsewhere that we know of. It had to do with the fact that the Greek language became the dominant language of the world, that we had what became the Old Testament Scriptures, the Jewish Scriptures, the Hebrew Scriptures, were standardized and translated into Greek. The Septuagint was developed, and it was accepted by the Jews. They considered the Septuagint to be legitimate, even though it was in Greek, and they had their scriptures in Hebrew and Aramaic. They said, that's great with us. We're fine with that. They were interested in telling the story, keeping it alive, and if that meant we changed the language, then we changed the language. And so you have also the Roman Empire. And, by the way, the political environment of Jerusalem. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, you hear about these groups in the Bible, in the Gospels. Those are political parties. Remember, they're a theocracy. Jerusalem is, the Jewish people. Their civic law, their spiritual law is the same law. So what we would think of as sectarian divisions or denominations in the church, that was political parties for them. Yeah.
Question. Theocracy, but didn't the Roman government require that allegiance was to them also?
Yes, for a time. We're going to talk about how that changed.
Okay.
But that's true. And Jeff was teasing me last week because when he put up his slide with the coin on it during his sermon last week, I was pointing at it, whispering.
Yeah.
What I was noticing was the name on the coin. That was a picture of Julius Caesar. It had Julius on one side. The other side is a word for God, and which is how they viewed Caesar. By the way, the name Caesar, because the Roman Empire expanded and extended into parts of modern-day Europe, years and years, centuries later, there was the establishment of something called the Holy Roman Empire, which had to do, it was kind of and we'll see this a lot in future weeks, the church and the state start getting in bed with one another quite a bit in European history, causes a lot of problems, and leads to the response that leads to us having our Bible the way we do today. But the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire, which was in Germany, what was the term for their leaders that they've used at various times? Anybody know? Kaiser. That's Caesar. That's the same word. Anyway, yes, the Roman view was that Caesar was God. He was their God. There's a lot of that in the book of Revelation, by the way. A lot of that kind of woven in. The idea that you pledge your allegiance to the true God, not the God of man, not the God of the state. So yes, now it does change with Constantine. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But the political influence and the political dynamic was that the Jewish people, their rulers, and they had a king, the Hasmonean dynasty first, then the Herodian Herod dynasty after that, in the time of Christ, they had an agreement with Rome. You protect us from people who are worse than you. You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. That governs all diplomacy. And it's the reason that we fight wars, and then a generation later we have to fight a war against the people we were helping in the first war. The Taliban, we made the Taliban. Issues that we had in Iraq 20 years ago, we did that. Because we were at war with Iran before we were with Iraq. That's history. That's how it goes. So, the same thing is true here, that the Jews wanted protection. They never wanted what happened with Antiochus Epiphanes and the Seleucians to happen again, so Rome was their protector, and they paid their taxes to Rome.
Well, that's where we get Roman Catholic.
It is indeed, which is what we're about to get to. I know you guys are itching to get to some Catholicism here. Okay, we'll get there. All right. So, and then we have, by the time Christ is born, we have the beginnings of a generally agreed upon Hebrew canon. Now, it looks different than our canon, than our collection of Old Testament books does. They number theirs differently. So if you ever were to research this or read about it, you'll see, the Hebrew canon was agreed upon, and it had 20 some odd books or whatever, and it's, we have 39, or no, I'm sorry, 39. And it might say they had like 28 or something. They have multiple books from Ezra. We have Ezra and Nehemiah. That's first Ezra in some canons. There's up to 4 Ezras in some of the other Bibles that you'll find, whether it's Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, North Africa. The North Africans are the Ethiopian church, Ethiopian Orthodox, that's what they're called. They have all of them. They take everything. They have more books than any of the others. So there's some numbering differences. But the content is pretty well agreed upon by the time of Christ. So that brings us to the writings of the New Testament. It's not quite as arduous and complicated as the Old Testament. The Old Testament is very, very ancient history. Okay, we have to kind of piece a few things together. And the environment in which that was written made it a little more complicated. Once you get to the New Testament, it's a little more straightforward because language is somewhat unified, the preservation of documents had been improved, and the concern for preserving documents was greatly improved. So we have a little more straightforward understanding of how this stuff was written, though there are still some questions, and we'll talk about that. How many of you have heard the term synoptic gospel? Okay. So we have 4 gospels in our Bible: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They were not the only gospels that were written, not the only accounts of Jesus' life that were written. And that's somewhat evident when Luke begins his gospel. He talks about efforts have been made to compile a complete telling and a complete retelling of the life of Jesus Christ. So there's other stuff out there. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that tell us the story of Jesus. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels. The root word there is, like synopsis. It's a retelling. It's a biographical account of Jesus' life. John is not considered a synoptic gospel because John has very little concern for telling things in order or telling the complete story. That's not the point. John wrote his gospel much later in the 1st century than Matthew, Mark, and Luke completed theirs. And so John takes the approach of, you guys already know where he was born and about the wise men and all that stuff. We're going to get to the part that's important for this point in time, and that is the divinity of Christ. John writes a gospel that is making a point about Christ's godhood and not so much about the who, what, where, and when, because there's stuff that just is out of order and different and that sort of thing. With the synoptic gospels, there are some evidences in the in the writings, in the manuscripts, that these three writers drew upon other works. Sound familiar? They were drawing upon other gospel accounts that have been written. The scholarly community refers to the source, the central source that it seems is shared by these three writers as Q, the Q source. I don't know why they named it that. Q. The Q source, there's some things that are common among those three gospels that are shared, so it seems like they were using some of the same material, but they then gathered their own. Obviously, Matthew writes from a much more Jewish perspective in his writing. You have Mark, whose gospel is very stark, and it's almost like a Hemingway novel. You know, why use a big word when you can use a small word? And it's very simple, and it's to the point. It's not very colorful, but it also has evidence of eyewitness account, and a lot of those who study this say that Peter was the primary source of Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel is in many ways Peter's gospel. And that has to do with sometimes we see the narrative focus shift and you go into someone's head. If Mark is writing this by himself and hasn't talked to anybody else, how does he know what Peter was thinking? So there's a lot of evidence that Peter was a primary source for Mark, and they would have been contemporaries of each other and known one another. Mark is a very important figure in the early church. He's considered the founder of the Coptic Church, which is the North African Christian church. In fact, he's kind of like their first pope, is kind of how he's considered. Luke was an investigative reporter. He gathered eyewitness accounts. He very likely talked to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and others who were with Jesus and saw Jesus. There's a lot of eyewitness testimony in Luke's gospel. So, we have, of course, the epistles, the letters that are a part of the New Testament. Many of them, especially Paul's letters, have authorship noted. He starts the letter by saying who he is. That carried a lot of weight, by the way, with the early church in the first several centuries when they were considering scriptural legitimacy. If the author identified himself, it was in. If there was questions on authorship, we got a problem. That's particularly difficult with Hebrews. The letter, we call it a letter, Hebrews, but it reads more like a transcript of spoken word when you read it. The prevailing theory is there is no one author of Hebrews. Some have obviously postulated Paul. It doesn't sound a lot like Paul in some ways, though it does carry evidence of expertise on Jewish law, on the history of the Jewish people, because it is a very strong comparison from the Old Testament to the New Testament, the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. But others have said Barnabas may have written it. Others have said possibly Phoebe or Priscilla, Aquila, any of those early movers and shakers in the church. But the prevailing theory as of right now is it's probably a transcript of a spoken sermon. This was probably a common sermon that was delivered in a local synagogue that someone finally wrote down, and it became traveled around the circles of the early church. But this issue of authorship became so serious for the early church that when they were attempting to piece together the canon several centuries later, Martin Luther, among many, for a long time objected to its placement in the canon because of the authorship questions, and others didn't know what to do with it. You'll notice where it falls in the order of our New Testament books. You have all of Paul's letters. Then you have the non-Pauline epistles. You have, Peter and James and John. And then right sandwiched in the middle is Hebrews. That was a compromise. Okay, we'll put it in the Bible, but we're not going to put it with the Paul letters, and we're not going to put it with the other letters. We'll just put it in the middle. That was a compromise, where it is in the Bible.
And if you look at the chronological order where they estimate these letters were written, James falls within 44, 49 AD.
Yeah, far earlier.
Galatians 49, 50. All the rest are in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
And John, of course, is last.
Yeah.
Seems, seems
Yeah.
like.
John did a lot of his writing there at the end, especially Revelation. That comes nearly the end of the first century.
80 and 90
Yeah,
AD.
yeah,
John.
yeah. And that is why his sound a lot different too. He's writing a different story. That brings up a point to make about the end of the book of John. If you read the Gospel of John. If you read the end of the Gospel of John, it sounds like he's closing the story, and then there's like 10 more verses or whatever. It looks like someone else, perhaps a disciple of John, and yes, the apostles and those early Christians did have their own disciples. It looks like some people who were disciples of John might have picked that up at some point and added those verses. The reason is, the theme of these early writings was Jesus is on his way back right now. He could come any day. They really believed the second coming was moments away, days away, months away. And they were hoping for it, praying for it, anticipating it. Well, then after a while, it hasn't happened yet. And you go, well, we need to adjust the timeline on this. Now, again, that's one of those things where we go, ooh, we don't like that. That makes me feel a little funny about it. But that was accepted common practice. Doesn't change the inspired nature of it, doesn't change the message of it, but adjust the story for the time frame of the reader. It's to our benefit that they would do those things. Correspondence between Christians became very important in the early days of the church. They wrote a lot of letters. Okay, that's the source of what we read. I mean, there were hundreds of different letters written by preachers and elders and teachers and early leaders in the church. We happen to have the ones we have, but there were others written. And they have not found their way into our canon for a variety of reasons, but they quoted Scripture extensively in their letters. And even private correspondence from one person to another, just writing, hey, how you doing? Wish you were here. How's school going? Whatever. They included Scripture in their personal correspondence with one another. And we have found a lot of that. We've found people's mail from the early centuries AD. And we have found quotations of what we call New Testament Scripture in there. So if I read one of Paul's letters or I heard it spoken, and I want to write to my buddy over here, and you ought to hear what this guy had to say. Here's what he said. To the point that if all of the manuscripts of the New Testament vanished today, we have in archives throughout the world personal correspondence of early Christians that contain all but 11 verses of the New Testament. Every verse of our New Testament canon, save 11 verses, is present in private correspondence between early Christians. It's not in the manuscripts. That's really amazing. That shows you the level to which they valued their Scripture. And there was extensive quoting of the Hebrew Scripture in these letters as well. Obviously, Paul. And he quoted from the Septuagint. When we read his manuscripts, he wrote it in Greek. He wrote from the Greek version of their Scripture. Scripture was well traveled, exchanged in letters, and then the question becomes, well, what did early Christians consider Scripture? What did they refer to as their Scripture? That question was a question forced upon them in many ways. Because Rome became far more aggressive against Christianity following the time of Christ, because it was so disruptive. You'll find, as we talk more about this morning, Rome, the Roman Empire, they had some pretty evil people who led. I mean, you think of Nero and who's the other one?
Caligula.
Caligula's one. There's one I'm thinking of, and I can't think of the name at the moment. That was also evil. We don't talk about enough. But yes, sometimes they're just antagonistic toward Christians. But a lot of times, what Roman leaders were concerned with was keeping the empire together, keeping it at peace, and keeping it growing so that they could continue enriching themselves on the taxes. Okay? Having that tax base united was very important to them. So sometimes it wasn't that they were anti-Christian, they were anti-trouble. Stop causing trouble And the Jews, and the Christians especially, were the problem children of the Roman Empire. So a lot of this aggression was to shut them up. And one of the things they did was they banned the possession of Scripture. Now think about that. You're a brand new church. You're a brand new faith, Christianity. And the government says, okay, you can't possess Scripture. And you go, what's Scripture? If the government banned our Scripture today, we know that means the Bible. What we call the Bible. Well, what did the early Christians? Well, that's revealed in what they were willing to risk their life for. That's the question that they had to answer early on. So this is actually, yeah, it's an attack on Christianity, but it's also a really wonderful, providential problem to have, because it forces the focus of the early church on what do we consider Scripture? What is important enough that we have that we're willing to die for? And we see that in the things we've discovered since, and in the proliferation of the writing that we've uncovered. So let's back up real quick, and I'll just address the Hebrew Scripture and where it was by this point. So there was a generally accepted canon by the time of Christ. Hebrew text, Aramaic text, and then there was Greek text, Septuagint. All accepted by the Jews. That changed in 313 AD. Does anybody know what happened in 313 AD? There was a fellow named Constantine. Becomes the Emperor of Rome. By the way, if you want to be really snotty and impress your friends, or not get invited to parties, the linguistically correct way to pronounce his name is Constantin. So just drop that in your next social gathering. Why don't you just pronounce Constantin and then sniff in really deep and hold your head up high, and then watch your social life fall apart. Constantin, but Constantine, we call him that. Okay, Constantine. In 313 AD, he issued what was called the Edict of Milan, which made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. We'll talk more about why that happened in a minute. But it was really important for the Jews. They don't like Rome. So Rome says, oh, we're Christians now. And they, of course, use the Greek language. And the Jews go, wait a minute, you're not on our team anymore. Well, then we're not using the Greek scriptures anymore. So from 313 on, the Jewish people have disregarded the Septuagint as legitimate scripture. They returned at that point to the Hebrew and Aramaic scriptures. And predominantly Hebrew, because they had already begun taking their Hebrew and shifting it to Aramaic because that had been their common language with the Targums. We talked about the Targums a week or two ago. So they're not using the Septuagint anymore. So the Jewish people return to a really strong focus on honing their scripture, correcting inaccuracies, correcting grammatical things, and refocusing on getting their scripture cleaned up. And that was important for Christians as well. Yeah.
Well, you kind of answered the question, because my thought was, what was the major difference between the Septuagint and the Hebrew?
There had been some changes that had crept in. A lot of it has to do with, and this is how, by the way, a lot of the people that study this, the researchers and scholars, figure some things out. They can read a piece of text, and if they're smart enough, they can figure out if that was originally written in Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek. Because the Jews, the Hebrews, have certain sayings, right? We all have certain sayings. We all have certain turns of phrase we use, idioms. Well, those are kind of exclusive to certain cultures. Like in the South, if I'm going to just sit down and rest for a minute, the old timers especially, they'll say, I'm going to sit a spell. I'm going to sit a spell? Oh. Yeah, that's what they say. I'm going to just sit a spell. You know where that phrase comes from when you hear it or when you read it. So if you read in Greek a turn of phrase that is common and exclusive to Hebrew, that gives you a clue as to where that was originally written. Sarah now has finished her first week of teaching at UW, so she's got a bunch of early 20-somethings. Now, the slang and the terminology and the phrases used. I'm officially old because they've gone places I can't go. I don't understand it. She had a student that she told me about, and this girl was talking to another girl and used this phrase. She said, "The vibes are valid." Help me out with that. What's wrong with saying that feels about right? The same thing. I don't understand it because I come from a different time, a different culture. Anyway, that kind of thing happens in language and has always happened in language. Look into it.
I got one for you.
Oh, let's hear it.
From the teenagers that I hear every day.
All right.
You're doing too much.
Well, and what does that mean? Trying too hard?
I don't know, but especially when you're like, can you get the class, please? You're doing too much.
Because you're meddling in their, what they're doing.
Yeah.
You're doing too much.
And then my response is, yeah, I know, not getting paid for it.
And one of the top 100 in the country, as we learned last week. All right, to be honored to do that. Yes.
I have teenagers,
Yeah.
and one day they were saying, "Oh man, that's bougie."
Bougie. That's a good one.
I'm
Yeah.
like, what?
Yeah. And they don't even know where that word comes from.
No, but they
Yeah.
means wow.
Yeah, it's fancy, and it's kind of used in a derisive way, like, you're bougie, meaning you're kind of snooty, or you like nice fancy things. There's another that comes from a very old word, bourgeoisie, the upper
Yeah,
class.
that's what he was.
Yeah, goes back to Karl Marx.
Well, and then they say
Thank
things
you.
like that they just slump, and I went, "Are they dead?"
Mm.
What do you mean? I'm forever
Yeah.
going, what does that mean?
One of the students in her class was talking about having some event or something, and the other person goes, "Oh, slay." I'm sorry, that sounds like you're encouraging someone to commit murder. I didn't know that was a good thing. Okay, back to this though.
Dungeons and Dragons.
What it did was focus the Jewish people and the people of the Hebrew faith on their scripture and on honing it and cleaning it up, and because they were rejecting the Greek, they were rejecting that culture, and so they return to the Hebrew, and it begins really about 1,000-year effort, because it took about 1,000 years before they had locked down what they call the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is the official canon of Judaism. Again, they have a different numbering of books in the Masoretic text, so it looks somewhat like our Old Testament, but not totally like our Old Testament. It's divided into 3 parts. They have the Torah, those first 5 books, that's their law, the Nabaim and the Ketuvim. Okay, so like your history and your prophets, so to speak. They also have a Talmud, which is an extra book of rabbinical writings. That's kind of their rule book. A lot of religions, this is kind of how we're different, although maybe not as different sometimes. A lot of other religions have like a holy text, and then they have a rule book that they wrote to put that text into practice. The Mormon Church, they're really savvy with this, because when they come around and want to meet you, and they just want to talk about Jesus, well, that doesn't seem very scary. That's harmless, right? I'm a Christian. You want to talk about Jesus? I guess we're on the same team. And in some ways we are. By the way, Mormon worship services look kind of similar to ours. They do a lot of the same things. But you get to talking, and they're like, well, look, we believe the same Jesus, same God, and everything. We just have this extra book, this other testament. Okay, seems harmless. Hey, maybe it's true. I don't know. Let's talk about it.
Gotta be a Moroni not to believe.
And then, that's right. And then, you get a little further down the path, and it's like, oh, by the way, here's another book. Oh, this is our book of rules and covenants. This says that the Latter-day Saint Church is the only real church, and you're not allowed to be a part of any other one. We're the only ones that can baptize. We're the only ones that can teach. The only ones that can perform weddings. So that's a whole different message than just Jesus.
In the 1800s, you get shot.
Yeah. And I'm not picking on Mormons necessarily. I'm just saying a lot of religious groups have a second book. their rule book. Jews have it too, called the Talmud. We don't really have that in Christianity. The Catholic Church does. Other denominations do. Churches of Christ generally don't because of our history. Although we sometimes have an unwritten one. Don't we? Run across that a time or two maybe? Yeah. We always said we're not a denomination, we don't enforce rules on other people, but there were like hundreds of different periodicals that were written over the last century or 2 centuries trying to enforce everyone into a certain conformity. And there were all these different teams and they all went at each other all the time. Yeah, we have that in our history. Every group does. Those are the things we have to navigate as we try to tell our story. So the early centuries of Christianity. Now we're from the 1st century to about the 4th century. Okay? From 0 through the 300s. Okay? This is an interesting time. The Roman Catholic Church has not yet been established, but the groundwork for its establishment is happening. And again, the question that continues to come up is, what do we consider Scripture? And I want to point something out that this is where the beginnings of separation between Christianity and Judaism really starts. And it kind of climaxes in 313 with the Edict of Milan. But Judaism and Christianity are like two sides of the same coin for those first 100 years, 200-300 years. And you see that in the New Testament writings, by the way. You see that a lot in, like James, his letter sounds very Jewish. Paul's letters, he's ministering to Gentiles, so that sounds different. But in Romans, you see it really clear. In Romans, Paul's writing, and he's got a mixed group in Rome of Christians. Because primarily, the Christians in Rome were Jews. And all Christians primarily were Jews early on. But the Emperor Claudius issued an edict that drove the Jews out of Rome, kicked them out. And so the church there becomes primarily Gentile. Well, then when the edict of Claudius is rescinded, the Jews come back. So by the middle part of the 1st century, you've got Jews and Gentiles. And the Jews come back to town and go, it's kind of like, you're in my seat on Sunday morning, everybody's got their assigned seat. It's like, we were here first. And the Gentiles were like, oh, really? Well, you killed Jesus. And so there's this conflict. It's a theological conflict, really, very deep. And Paul's trying to deal with that. And we see that divide because Christianity, the gospel was preached in the synagogues. That's another big development in the intertestamental period. The establishment of synagogues, local congregations, local houses of worship. Paul was teaching in the synagogues. The early apostles and Christians were meeting in the synagogues and talking about Christ. Try going to the synagogue today and preaching the gospel. You won't last long. But at the time, it was just another flavor of Judaism. The divide became much, much stronger as time went on, and completely separated now, but sharing some really important foundational elements. That's important. We do draw a lot of foundational things from Judaism. It's very evident, and I think that's important to know. One other thing I want to say about the epistles. It's a kind of a caution. Because sometimes we try to treat those books, those letters, like that separate rule book that other churches and faiths have. Okay, well, what do we do about communion? Well, let's go to 1 Corinthians, let's see what the rule book says. Well, what do we do about women? Oh, let's go to 1 Timothy, let's see what the rule. And it's fine to draw understanding and information and some conclusions from those letters. But understand this, when we read those scriptures, we are reading someone else's mail. That was written at a time to a group of people for a specific purpose. Does it change the conclusion we come to? Maybe, maybe not. But does it help to understand that in Ephesus, when Paul wrote to Timothy, there was a religious sect that was led by women who were promoting sexual promiscuity as a means to achieve spiritual superiority, and they were infiltrating the Christian church and trying to disrupt their worship. Does that change how we read 1 Timothy chapter 2? Maybe. I'm not telling you what to believe doctrinally about that. I'm saying it's important to know the context. And we have to handle those scriptures carefully. And understand we should be viewing all of that, because like we talked about the first week, Jesus said, all authority has been given to me, not to Paul. I love Paul. I love reading Paul. I think there's a lot my understanding of Christianity, of Jesus, has been enriched because of Paul. But I have to read Paul through the lens of Christ, because that's how he'd want me to read it. I don't read Christ through the lens of Paul. So I offer that to you to just point out. Oh, another thing I want to point out. Sorry, I'm leaving teaching and going to preaching real quick. We see a lot of different groups in the early church, Jew, Gentile, and others. And Paul deals with those issues, and Peter has to deal with those issues. Important note. In Scripture, God and those who write on his behalf mention nations, tongues, and peoples. Never mentions race. There's no such thing as race in the Bible. There are different languages, there are different geographic regions, and different ethnicities, but they don't talk about race. Because race is a human concept we invented. We invented that. People come from different places and they speak different languages. But different colors, yeah, we decided that was something to draw some lines over. Not in the Bible. Being racist is the stupidest thing you can be. Because you're fighting over something that's made up. That's like who would win, Superman or Batman? Who cares? They're both made up.
Superman.
Probably. It's the heat vision for me. That does it. But, sorry. Now I went from preaching to meddling. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so we have the four Gospels and the Pauline epistles, and those were generally considered scripture by the early church. Other letters as well that were of the same time period, but by the end of the first century and into the second century, the 27 books that we have in our New Testament were available, and they were all pretty well considered authoritative scripture and important and valuable to the early church. However, the complete canon we have, our 66 books, or the equivalent of it, would not really be available and contained all in one place for another 100 years. It would be about another 100 years or more before all 66 books were really beginning to be considered as part of the Christian canon. It was all out there, all floating around, and different groups said, okay, we like this and that and the other. But it all starts to get put together over the next few hundred years. And that had a lot to do with what we talked about earlier. Christians noticed, by the way, what the Jews were doing with their scripture as they rejected the Septuagint and went back, and they started having the same conversations. We need to take a look at these and make sure we've got them right. We need to take a look at some of this writing and make sure that we clean it up and that we're getting the right story, preserving the words as they're intended. So a lot of stuff's happening those first few hundred years after Jesus in terms of honing the scripture, focusing in on the scripture, and collecting it and putting it together. There was a North African bishop or early church leader by the name of Origen. He did a lot with this. He actually wrote parallel Bibles. He was an excellent scholar. Have you ever owned a parallel Bible? Anybody ever had a parallel Bible? I loved it. I had one when I was younger and still have it. I just don't use it as much because I have a phone now. But it's great because you can look at different versions at the same time. Origen wrote the first parallel Bible. It was actually 6 different versions of Scripture all put together. Different languages, different translations, all of that. It was called the Hextapella. We actually have a piece of that. It has been discovered and uncovered and confirmed. We have portions of Origen's Hextapella. Really cool. And by the way, when they read it, the translations are accurate and the words are still consistent with what we have today. Really amazing. Really amazing. A guy named Justin Martyr and another fellow named Polycarp, not the kind of name you want to give to your child, but it was his name. They began developing the early concepts of, hey, we need an agreed upon canon. We got to agree upon the words. Canon just means collection of scripture. The official, affirmed, confirmed, agreed upon collection of books and letters. What's that?
Rules of the road.
Rules of the road. There you go. All right. Move on from there. Pointer is not pointing. Jeff, you might have to help me out here.
What do you want?
Go to the next slide. My thing stopped working. Okay. I'm going to introduce you to another new word. We kind of went over some vocabulary a few weeks ago. The word codex. Anybody ever heard the word codex used in this kind of discussion? So codex is just a collection of scripture. It's a collection all put together, and we have a great number of codexes in archives that have been discovered and recovered and preserved. Codexes would have just been all these different books that were starting to be put together into a singular volume.
Do a lot of those reside in Rome?
They reside in a lot of different places, actually. Rome has some. You'll notice the names of some of the ones that you see a lot in the literature. The Codex Vaticanus, Vatican, that's their codex. There's the Codex Sinaiticus, which sounds like what happens to my upper respiratory system during soybean harvest, but that's actually Sinai, like the mountain, that was pieced together and discovered at a monastery in Egypt. Great, and that story, by the way, is wild. I can't wait to tell you that one. Alexandrinus, another codex, Library of Alexandria, or that region, and the Leningrad Codex. There's actually one over in Russia that we found. All of these codexes are a little bit different. Some of them have some books, some of them don't, okay? But they do represent the earliest of efforts to put together manuscripts into singular volumes. And what we learn from that then is at different points in time what was considered scripture, or what was being discussed or considered in scripture. Some codexes you can date based on what they have or what they don't have. There's a lot of debate. Sometimes I mentioned this, I think, last week. Mark 16:16. That's a big church Christ verse right there. He that believes in baptized shall be saved. And there's some disagreement about that because you have a little footnote that says early manuscripts, do not. Yeah, but a lot of these codexes do. Codex Vaticanus has it in there. So we know that at a certain point, that was widely accepted. Yeah.
So, how did the different geographic areas come to a conclusion? Because I would see the Vatican said, oh no, mine's the real.
As far as the geographic locations, that has more to do with where that collection is housed, or who paid for it to be put together, more so than where it originated. A lot of the codexes, it's believed, originated from Constantine, because he put out an order early on, hey, we need Bibles. We need a collection of all scripture in one place for our churches to have. So he commissioned Bibles to be put together, and some of those early codexes are probably the efforts to do that. It's not so much that they're an authoritative canon for those locations. They are an archaeological artifact that are housed by those locations. So I'm going to talk briefly as I can. I heard a bell, but I got a few minutes. What's that?
4 minutes.
4 minutes. Okay, let's do it real quick. Lightning round. 313 AD, Constantine issues the Edict of Milan. It codifies Christianity as the official religion of Rome. Is that because Constantine was a Christian?
No, his wife was.
That's what everyone says. That's kind of the urban legend. Maybe she was. And by the way, there are a lot of men in this country that are at church because of their wives. So, more power to her if that's the case. However, it's pretty well agreed upon. It wasn't so much a spiritual awakening for Constantine as much as it was an attempt to solidify the power and the scope of the Roman Empire. You've got a lot of different people and cultures all spread across the known world that are part of your empire. What's the best way to unify them? Give them a singular religion that they must follow. So, was Constantine a good guy or a bad guy? He's kind of a in-between guy. But he did make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, and thus the dominant religion in the world. What that leads to then is, all right, could we get all of us in this room to agree on everything about Scripture? Probably not. You're definitely not going to get an entire empire to do it. So what it creates is an environment where you have to establish some order, you have to establish some hierarchy, some governance, who's going to set the rules and enforce the rules, and so Constantine starts noticing there's disagreement, so he calls together these councils, all right, these groups, these conferences, to agree upon some things. One of the early issues resulted in the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. There was a guy named Arius, and a guy named Alexander. They were early bishops or cardinals or leaders of the church, and there was a disagreement that arose. Arius and his group believed that Jesus was created by God. He was begotten by God, because John 3:16, his only begotten Son. So Jesus was born of God, but he's not God. That was what they were teaching. Others considered that heresy. So Constantine, there is a letter, a personal letter he wrote, and he said, I don't care what you decide, just stop fighting. You see, he didn't really care about getting it right. He just wanted everyone to be at peace so that tax money keeps coming in. So he gets the Council of Nicaea together. They're trying to form a consensus on church order, church governance, and doctrine. A lot of the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church, which is what this becomes, is traced back to the Council of Nicaea. Also the Nicene Creed, if you've been around Catholicism or Christianity in general. The Nicene Creed is a pretty good encapsulation of what Christians believe. It comes from this meeting. It established organizational structure, dealt with the Arian question. Yes, that's where we get the word Arian, from Arius. But there's no evidence that the canon was established by this time. It was a little bit later. I'll close with this great story. It comes from the Council of Nicaea, and it's just a fun story. Arius is going on about his doctrinal belief about Jesus being begotten and not being God himself or existing at the same time as God. And there's another bishop who's getting pretty angry about it. And he's just steaming mad. His name was Nicholas. He later was canonized and became Saint Nicholas. And he got up, and he marched across the room, and he got in Arius' face, and they exchanged words, and then Nicholas punched Arius in the face. So, come Christmas time, when you tell your kids that Santa's watching, Santa punched a guy for denying the divinity of Christ. Just food for thought.
Was the name you were trying to come up with, that was an emperor, Domitian?
Yes.
Around the time of
Domitian.
the Book of Revelation?
Yes. He's the one that's pretty directly referenced in Revelation.
Yeah,
Any other comments or
he wanted
questions?
everybody to bow down.
Yes. Yeah, the deity of the state. Any other comments or questions?
Mark was on.
Sorry. Anything? All right, great. Next